In 1879, 3 South American nations went to war, and by the time it ended, one of them had been wiped off the map as a coastal power forever. Historians call it the War of the Pacific. That's technically true. But the real prize both sides were fighting and dying for was not land or pride or politics. It was bird droppings, specifically a white, crusty mineral hiding beneath those droppings that could make crops explode with growth, or just as easily, make a cannon shell explode with force. And before this story ends, that same substance will help one empire survive a war it should have lost, and quietly make an entire industry of human bondage profitable for nearly 3 decades. But before we get there, we need to go back. Because this story starts on a handful of barren islands off the coast of Peru, and it takes a long, dark road before it explodes into war. For thousands of years, millions of seabirds nested on a cluster of rocky islands off the Peruvian coast in one of the driest climates on Earth. Because it almost never rains there, their droppings never washed away. Instead, they piled up, layer after layer, century after century, hardening into deposits that in some places reached over 150 feet thick. The Inca civilization understood the value of this material long before any European ever laid eyes on it. They called it Guano, the word guano comes directly from it, and they protected the bird colonies so fiercely that disturbing the nesting birds during breeding season carried a penalty of death. To the Inca, guano was not garbage. It was the reason their farms in one of the most arid landscapes on the planet could feed an empire. For centuries after the Spanish conquest, almost nobody outside the Andes had any idea this resource existed. Then, in 1802, a German explorer named Alexander von Humboldt sailed along the Peruvian coast and noticed local farmers hauling this strange material inland to fertilize their fields. He took samples back to Europe and had them analyzed. What chemists found inside stunned them. The deposits were saturated with nitrogen and phosphorus, the exact nutrients that exhausted European farmland was desperately short of. Word spread slowly at first. Then, in the 1840s, as European and American agriculture began running into a hard ceiling on how much food worn-out soil could produce, guano went from a regional curiosity to the most sought-after fertilizer on Earth. And that name, guano, is worth remembering. Because what started as bird droppings on a remote island was about to become one of the most valuable commodities in the world. And Peru was about to discover that owning it came with a price written in human suffering. The Peruvian government moved fast. It declared the Guano Islands a state monopoly, and almost overnight guano exports became the single largest source of revenue for the entire Peruvian state, at its peak responsible for the majority of the government's annual income. The demand was so enormous that across the Atlantic, an American president stood up in front of Congress and personally promoted bird droppings. In 1850, Millard Fillmore told the nation in his State of the Union address that guano had become so essential to American farming that the government had a duty to secure it by whatever means necessary. Within 6 years, Congress passed the Guano Islands Act, a law that let any American citizen claim any unclaimed island on Earth, for any country, for the sole purpose of scraping up bird droppings. The United States went on to annex nearly 100 islands across the Pacific and the Caribbean under that single law. Some of them are still American territory today. An empire's first overseas land grab, and the prize was excrement. But here was the problem. Guano mining is brutal, filthy work, closer to the worst conditions of a coal mine than to farming. Laborers had to hack the hardened deposits apart with picks under a blazing equatorial sun, on islands where temperatures could climb past 100 degrees, and there was no shade, no fresh water, and barely a flat place to sleep. The dust hung in the air so thick it blotted out the sun, and mixed with ammonia fumes so caustic they burned the eyes, throat and lungs raw with every breath. Workers wore nothing but a handkerchief tied over the nose and mouth, and even that did little. Some accounts from the period describe men coughing blood within weeks of arriving. Each laborer was expected to dig and haul roughly 5 tons of guano a day, on shifts that often ran 17 hours, 6 or 7 days a week, with no real rest in between. Peru did not want its own citizens doing this work, so it turned to labor sources it considered disposable. Beginning in 1849, Peru imported tens of thousands of indentured laborers from China, eventually somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men. Most of them tricked or coerced into contracts they barely understood. Some were told that they were sailing for California to mine gold. Others were simply kidnapped off the streets of Chinese port cities and never saw home again. Workers from Polynesia and Easter Island were taken the same way, swept into the same system. Conditions were so lethal that one 19th-century British newspaper reported a chilling claim that of the first 4,000 Chinese laborers shipped to the islands, by 1860 it was believed not a single one had survived. By some estimates, more than 2 out of every 3 laborers sent to the Guano Islands never made it home. Workers who tried to escape the islands by drowning themselves were not uncommon. Not everyone went quietly. In 1852, 400 Chinese laborers being shipped toward the Guano Islands rose up against the crew of the vessel carrying them in what later became known as the Cargo Rebellion, one of the only recorded mutinies of its kind on the Pacific. It did not stop the trade. The ships kept sailing, the contracts kept being signed under false promises, and the islands kept demanding more hands than anyone could spare. But it is worth remembering that the men hauling that fertilizer were never simply victims standing still. This was, in nearly every meaningful sense, slavery wearing a contract as a disguise, operating in the open, financed by a fertilizer the entire Western world desperately wanted, and largely ignored by the governments buying it. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. The guano boom built railways, funded armies, and made Peru for a few decades one of the wealthiest nations in South America on paper. But it could not last. Guano deposits, no matter how thick, are finite, and by the 1860s the richest islands were running dry. So that's exactly when attention shifted inland, into the bone-dry Atacama Desert, where geologists had found something almost as valuable buried beneath the sand. A mineral called caliche, rich in sodium nitrate, also known as Chilean saltpeter. And in solving the problem of guano running out, the nations of South America accidentally set the stage for the bloodiest war the continent had ever seen. The nitrate deposits sat beneath Bolivian and Peruvian territory, but it was Chilean companies and Chilean workers who did most of the mining, drawn south by wages and opportunity in a region none of the 3 governments fully controlled or fully understood the value of. For years, this arrangement held loosely under treaties nobody trusted very much. Then, in 1878, Bolivia tried to raise taxes on a Chilean nitrate company operating on its soil, violating an earlier treaty. Chile refused to pay and sent troops to seize the nitrate port of Antofagasta. Peru, bound to Bolivia by a secret defense treaty signed years earlier specifically because both nations feared Chilean expansion, was pulled into the fight almost immediately. What followed was 5 years of brutal warfare across deserts, mountains, and the open ocean, a conflict so thoroughly defined by its cause that it became known as the Saltpeter War. Chile's navy and army proved decisively superior. Lima, Peru's capital, was occupied by Chilean forces for more than 2 years. By the time a truce was signed in 1884, somewhere around 18,000 soldiers were dead, and the map of South America had been permanently redrawn. Chile annexed the entire nitrate-rich coastal region. Bolivia, which had possessed a coastline before the war, became a landlocked nation, a status it still holds to this day. Peru lost valuable territory, and watched the war's debts cripple its economy for a generation. Chile, almost by accident, had become the sole owner of the most valuable strategic mineral on the planet. Chilean nitrate did not just happen to benefit from the outcome of that war. The war was fought specifically to determine who would control it, and for the next 3 decades, that control would shape the fate of nations who had never set foot in South America at all. By the early 1900s, Chilean saltpeter was not just feeding the world's farms, it was arming the world's militaries, because the same nitrogen compound used to grow wheat is also the essential ingredient in gunpowder and high explosives. Roughly 500,000 tons of Chilean nitrate were being shipped to Europe and the United States every single year, and the major powers of the world had quietly built their entire capacity to wage war on a supply chain running through a desert in northern Chile. And there was a witness of sorts hidden inside the chemistry itself, a vulnerability nobody had noticed until it was almost too late. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the British Royal Navy moved immediately to blockade German ports, cutting Germany off from Chilean nitrate entirely. By most calculations, Germany had perhaps a few months of nitrate reserves left. Without it, the German military could not manufacture explosives, and without explosives, the war would have been over astonishingly fast. Germany was staring down a defeat written not in battlefield losses, but in chemistry. What saved Germany was a process developed just a few years earlier by a chemist named Fritz Haber, working alongside an engineer named Haber-Bosch at the German chemical company BASF. The Haber-Bosch process did something that had sounded almost like alchemy. It pulled nitrogen directly out of the air, the same air everyone on Earth breathes, and combined it with hydrogen under enormous pressure to manufacture ammonia synthetically, with no guano, no Chilean desert, and no ocean blockade required. Germany rushed the technology into industrial production almost overnight, converting that ammonia into explosives like TNT. Historians now broadly agree the Haber-Bosch process directly prolonged World War I by years, allowing Germany to keep fighting long after its natural nitrate supply had been cut off completely. The irony was almost too perfect. A war partly fueled by the desperate global hunger for nitrogen had triggered the invention of a technology that destroyed nitrogen's entire natural market. Once the war ended, the Haber-Bosch process did not go away. It spread to nearly every industrialized country on Earth because it could produce nitrogen fertilizer faster, cheaper, and in far greater quantity than any desert or any island ever could. Chile's nitrate exports, the mineral an entire war had been fought over, collapsed within a generation. The deserts that had once been worth invading sat largely abandoned, their boomtowns turned into ghost towns almost overnight, the same fate that had already quietened the Guano Islands decades earlier. There is a deeper cover-up buried inside this story, one most people never learn. For decades, governments and fertilizer companies on every side of this trade downplayed exactly how interchangeable agricultural nitrate and military explosive-grade nitrate really were. Farmers were told they were buying fertilizer. Generals understood they were buying gunpowder. The same ships, the same companies, and often the very same shipments served both markets simultaneously. It is the same playbook that would surface again, decades later, in one of history's darkest footnotes. The German chemical conglomerate IG Farben, built in part on the same nitrogen-fixing science Fritz Haber pioneered, would go on to manufacture Zyklon B, the gas used in Nazi extermination camps, marketed for years beforehand as an agricultural pesticide. A dual-use arrangement that began with fertilizer and gunpowder quietly became a template, the same blurring of civilian and military supply chains that would later define controversies around chemical and nuclear technology throughout the rest of the 20th century. Today, the Haber-Bosch process that ended the nitrate wars produces the overwhelming majority of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer used worldwide, and agricultural scientists widely credit it with making it possible to feed a global population that has grown past 8 billion people, a number that simply could not be supported on guano and Chilean desert minerals alone. But that miracle carries its own modern price. The Haber-Bosch process is estimated to consume between 1 and 2% of all the energy produced on Earth every single year, almost entirely from fossil fuels, and nitrogen runoff from synthetic fertilizer has become one of the leading causes of waterway pollution and dead zones in oceans and lakes around the world. A pile of bird droppings on a desert island, valuable enough that an American president campaigned for it and a nation went to war over it. Tens of thousands of indentured laborers worked and died to dig it out of the ground. A war that erased a nation's coastline forever. A German laboratory that pulled fertilizer and gunpowder directly out of thin air to keep a losing war alive, and a dual-use secret that would echo into one of humanity's darkest chapters. The same white crystal that once made crops explode with growth could just as easily make a cannon shell explode with force, and the food on your plate tonight almost certainly grew because of a chemistry trick invented to win a war over bird poop. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things. We have got a lot more coming.